Good morning. My name is Andy Boulton. I am a policy analyst here at Building Codes Division, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us today to discuss rulemaking related to energy code adoption process. This meeting is being recorded to maintain a record of the advice provided today. There is an agenda for the meeting that was provided in advance. If you do not have access to the agenda today, I will be providing background in advance of the discussion of each issue. In addition, the agenda is available on the division's website, and I'm hoping that either Laura or Melissa can drop that into the chat right now, just so that folks can click on that if they need to access the agenda there. Some of you may be used to our board meetings that are a little bit more formal and require motions and votes. This is a less formal process that does not require any motions. We encourage participants to have an open discussion to provide feedback, information, and ideas. Since we're in a virtual format with a fair number of participants, I will ask that folks on the computer use the raise hand function during the meeting. I will attempt to call on folks in the order I see the hand raised. That said, I understand some folks might be on the phone and there could be a difficulty using that feature. So if it's necessary, just to feel free and speak up and jump into the conversation if you see fit. As we go along, if you have any advice specifically on fiscal impacts of the issues that we're discussing, we rely on those thoughts to file when we file our rules with the Secretary of State. So please keep this in mind as we discuss the options. We want to know any costs or savings to you or the people you represent or others. Since this is a virtual meeting, please keep in mind that your microphone will pick up background noises and conversations. I'm sure we're all used to that by now. You can use mute to prevent these background noises when you're not wanting to speak at the meeting. If you are on the phone, please do not put us on hold, because then the hold music may play on our end and we can't really do anything to stop it at that point. If you need to log off, feel free to log off and then call back in. That's no problem at all. To start, we would like to know who is present at the meeting today. I've introduced myself. I'm Andy Boulton. BCD's administrator, Alana Cox, is also here with us if she wants to say hello. There she is. Additionally, for sort of technical support, Mark Heiser and Kelly Thompson, Kelly Thomas from the division are here to help answer any questions should they arise about energy code, reach code, if we need their help. There are also some BCD staff that are here observing, and some of the folks, as I mentioned before, Laura and Melissa, that are here helping me make all the right levers and buttons go make this whole thing work. To save on time, I'm not going to introduce every potential BCD staff member that's present observing, but for all others, I am going to run through our RSVP list to identify who is present. I'm just going to call out the names on my list, and if you could confirm you are here, say nothing if you are not here. And if you are here on behalf of another organization, or if you're here representing an organization, go ahead and say who you are representing as well. If I do not call your name, there will be an opportunity at the end to identify anybody that is here to participate that is not on my list. All right, starting off. And I apologize if I don't get your last name exactly right. John Kuba?
Yeah, I'm here.
Are you here on behalf of an organization, John?
Yeah, Malarkey.
Okay. Matt Tidwell? Okay. Doesn't sound like Matt's here. Michael Rosenberg?
I'm here, and I manage the Building Energy Codes program at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory.
Thank you, Michael. Kristen Adams.
Hi, Kirsten Adams. I represent Associated General Contractors.
Thank you. Brian Krieg.
Yes, Brian Krieg here. I represent the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and then the Sheet Metal Workers Union, Local 16, and then also the contractors of SMACNA, the Sheet Metal Air Conditioning Contractors Association.
Thanks, Brian. Donald McCordrum, sorry.
No worries, McCordrum, yeah. I'm here with TRC representing Energy Trust of Oregon EPS New Construction Program, but just here as an SME as needed.
Thank you. Todd Russell. Okay. No Todd. Kevin Dwell. Okay. Rich Anderson. Okay. Gary Heikkinen.
Yeah, hi, Gary Heikkinen, energy consultant, working on contract in Northwest Natural right now. Also sit on the Building Code Structures Board and Construction Industry Energy Board. Thanks.
Thank you. Justin Wood.
I'm here representing the Oregon Home Builders Association.
Thank you. Joseph McClay. Okay. Blake Schlide.
Yeah, hi, Blake Schlide with the Oregon Department of Energy.
All right. David Vantoff.
Yeah, hi, Dave Vantoff representing Climate Solutions.
All right. Lauren Bowling.
Here representing NECA and the Associated Wall and Ceiling Contractors.
Okay. David Eslin.
I'm here and I'm representing the Zero Coalition of Oregon.
Kathy Olwes. Okay. Knowledge Murphy. Okay. Daryl Fuller.
I'm here representing the Oregon State Association of Plumbing, Heating, and Cooling Contractors.
Jed Sherman.
Good afternoon, Jed Sherman with the IAPMO Group.
Okay, thank you all. That is all the RSVPs I have. There's a few names I saw pop up on the Zoom that were not on my RSVP list. So I'm going to call out the ones I have here, and then at the very end of that, anybody else that I did not catch who joined, we'll do that just to avoid a fray here. I saw Chris Carpenter.
Yeah, Chris Carpenter here with UA Local 290 and the Plumbing and Mechanical Contractors Association here in Oregon.
All right. And Penny Cole.
Hi, Penny Cole. I'm with DLR Group High Performance Design.
Eric Lacey.
Yeah, Eric Lacey, Responsible Energy Codes Alliance.
And Roger Caney.
Hi, Roger Caney with the Oregon Department of Energy.
Okay, that is all the names I had on the RSVP or that I was able to catch as they were popping up. Is there anybody who is here now who's looking to participate that I have not called? Go ahead and state your name and anybody who you may represent.
Ryan Tribbett, National Electrical Contractors Association and Associated Wall and Ceiling Contractors.
Hey, Andy, this is Matt Tidwell with Portland General Electric.
All right, last chance for, sorry.
Yeah, no, this is Jonathan Belmont with the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance.
Okay. All right, going once, going twice, and we're off. Okay, we're going to go ahead and jump right in to the very first issue on our agenda, which is the limiting residential energy code change proposals to a single issue or allowing proposals to include multiple issues. The background here is the division seeks feedback on whether the division should continue to ask residential energy code amendment proposals to be limited to one single issue in the proposal or whether multiple issues should be allowed in a single proposal. Currently, the residential energy code amendment proposals should be limited to one issue. This is articulated in the code amendment proposal form. The proposal may include changes to multiple code sections if the single issue affects multiple code sections. The single issue limit makes it easier to analyze the impact of that issue alone because the impact analysis does not include the interaction between changes from multiple issues. A couple of the options that the division wanted to put forward for discussion is to continue to limit the code amendment proposals to one issue per proposal, allow residential energy code amendment proposals to include multiple proposed changes relating to multiple issues per proposal, or define the number of issues in a proposal in some other way. Does anybody have any thoughts?
This is Daryl. I'm on my phone, so I don't have a raise my hand function that I can find, but I like the single subject rule. It works really well at the Oregon legislature when we're changing statutes, that you don't end up with 6 you like and 2 you don't, and you end up having to swallow 2 that you think you could defeat because you like 4 when they're bundled together. Just the notion that each one has to rise or fall on its own merit seem to be a system that works pretty well in the Legislative Assembly, and I would like to see it continue with it here.
Thanks, Daryl. I got Gary Heikkinen and then Justin Wood on deck.
Yeah, I'm Gary Heikkinen. I'm in support of keeping the single subject way of doing this. I've served on numerous review committees, and it's much easier to review and dissect if it's one at a time. Understanding that somebody's got multiple ideas, it'd be nice to put it on one sheet of paper, but I'm in favor of keeping the one subject rule.
Justin? You're still on mute, Justin.
Sorry, still muted. Yeah. So yeah, I'll echo what they said. I think the single issue makes it easier to discuss something on its merits and kind of discuss the value of it without it getting lost into other things. Working in Washington as well, I've seen some issues lately where there's you've had kind of things mixed together, and so sometimes one thing that's important gets lost with other things. And so I think the single issue makes that easier.
Okay. David Essen?
Yeah, thank you. I think I understand the point of view around keeping it with a single issue, but yeah, I think sometimes a single issue is hard to define. And I would point out that in this last go around of residential code, there were some things that seemed like one issue, but had relationships to, for instance, both ventilation requirements and energy impacts. And I believe that in that experience, the analysis of it from a single issue point of view actually didn't do the debate justice and led to a lot of actual confusion from that analysis, where if it had been able to be analyzed in a different fashion, you could have seen a more complete picture. And I know that that process was a little different because in that example, the proposal was brought forward by the staff rather than an independent entity making a proposal. But if an independent entity had made that similar proposal, I think the understanding of that would have been best suited if they were allowed to address a couple issues within the same proposal. And just looking forward at where things are at, I could see there are more opportunities when you're going to have interrelationship between issues when a code proposal is being made. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Anybody else like to jump in on issue 1?
This is Dave Vantoff. I would just, I guess, second what Dave Heslam just said. That there's been several references to the legislature and single subject, but that subject could be, in the legislative context, can be extremely broad, relating to energy, and it could, you could end up with everything that the BCD does under one proposal. So it's I think more an issue of how the staff handles deciding what an issue is and where it's going to be most effective from as David said, the analysis and conversation perspective.
Thanks, Dave.
I don't know if you're looking for dialogue or just comments, but if you'll indulge me, I kind of agree a little bit with the two people who just spoke, but I guess what I would encourage we look at is the notion that if you have multiple changes as part of a package, you certainly could submit 5 or 6 rule changes that are all essentially the same package, but each of the rule changes would have to be reviewed and adopted separately in such a way that people reviewing them would understand the totality of it and the impact that would happen if all of them aren't together. But I still think that the notion that each one of them have to rise or fall on their own merits could still be part of a package. I don't think there's anything in the single subject rule, if you will, that would limit how robust the package is in terms of the people forwarding the notion of a package deal, including the other things that will be dealt with as part of their overall package. But it could still be a single subject change requirement.
Thanks, Darren. David?
Yeah, and just continuing that line of discussion further, I'd say there are additional examples where a package of measures might have been suggested, and then within the review committee process, some of those were disentangled from the package, and so the package was discussed as a partial package rather than the complete package. And within that context, then unintended consequences, can happen, because the package may have been analyzed to work with all elements combined, but then within the rather abbreviated process of a committee discussing it, the ramifications of only passing a portion of it aren't fully able to be analyzed during the moment. So to me, this is part of a broader question, that you can do things like this if there's a longer time frame within which these are being analyzed and discussed. Because it may be that if initial analysis was done that is looking at multiple measures in combination with one another, and then a review committee wants to think about, taking 3 of the 5 or something, they're not going to have a chance for that to be informed unless they have enough time in their process for that to be reanalyzed with just the 3 out of the 5, working, or 3 out of the 6, or whatever it is. And in general, in the past, that time has not been available. In my experience in participating in these specific processes, there's always been a time crunch when it came to these energy code elements, and the word has always been, we don't have time to analyze that, we just have to move on. So I just want to share, I think it's not on the agenda here, but if we want to be able to analyze these things and see them in conjunction with one another, you're going to need time, and you're going to need time potentially for iterative analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Gary.
Yeah, thanks. I would certainly support allowing enough time for proper vetting and proper analysis, regardless of where we land on single issue or package of issues. I would certainly support allowing enough time for proper analysis. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Did you have something else, David, or no? Oh, thanks.
No, just didn't lower my hand.
No worries. Alana.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks everyone for the conversation today. Been informative so far. I completely understand and appreciate the feedback on timing. I don't believe we have any rules around time, but certainly one of our goals is on energy adoption, in particular for the residential code, to make sure we build in enough time both to have the kind of conversation we want to have that allows that analysis to take place, and also to get our printed code books on time, which is kind of a constant struggle for us on the publishing side. So that's part of why we wanted to have this conversation right now. Just to back up, I really appreciate everyone being here today. I know some of you are probably multitasking with the special session that's going on, and there's a lot of moving pieces, but we wanted to have this conversation before we kick off residential code adoption again, so that we kind of know where we stand. And just a flag on the kind of one issue versus multiple issues. I think it really relates to another issue on our list here for consideration, which is what our inputs and assumptions are when we're modeling. And do we want these things modeled as a package or individually? So I think they're kind of related issues. I just wanted to throw that out there for consideration. Thanks.
Thanks, Alana. Justin Wood.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think just consistently, I think the ICC, and I know we have our own code, but ICC tends to look at these from a single issue standpoint. I know in some situations where we've had multiple issues kind of lumped together, it almost makes them harder to review them, because I understand what David's saying about making sure that you don't lose pieces of something important. But when you look at one issue that's got 15 pieces to it, sometimes it feels like, when I've looked at some of these in the past, that it gets kind of confusing to figure out where everything lies rather than being able to look at things one piece at a time.
Thanks, Justin. Any other thoughts to jump in on? Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to scroll down to the next issue. All right. Issue 2 is the base energy code process versus the reach code process. I'm looking for feedback on any processes that should be different for the adoption of the required or base codes versus the commercial and residential reach codes. Currently, the process for developing and adopting a base code is outlined generally by OAR 918-008-0020 and involves the following general steps: division selecting a base model code that amendment proposals are based upon, soliciting and accepting code amendment proposals, the appropriate board appointing a code review committee to study the proposals, the appropriate board reviewing the code review committee recommendations and final approval of the new code, and the division completing rulemaking and adoption. The process for adopting the REACH code, those largely at the discretion of the division. During the last residential REACH code cycle, the division first finalized the base code that the REACH code improved upon. Second, the division solicited public proposals to be included in the REACH code. Third, the division used the public proposals to craft a proposed REACH code to present to the board and solicited public comment on that proposal. Finally, the division presented the proposed REACH code to the board for approval. The division seeks feedback on the extent to which the REACH code adoption process should mirror the base code adoption process, and if there are areas where the two processes should differ. So 2 options we have in there for discussion. REACH code adoption process should, as much as possible, be the same as the base code adoption process and should commence after the base code requirements are determined. The REACH code adoption process should differ from the base code adoption process or commence at a different point in the base code adoption process. Please specify any suggested differences that you think should be made part of the REACH code process. I did not see who came first between Dave and Justin. I'm trying to start with Dave since he's left on my screen and Justin, you're right. So Dave, then Justin's on deck.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm not in the weeds on this the way some of the other folks are, but it would make sense to me that you would develop the two the same way and through the same processes. And I guess, you went through that explanation of how you do the base code under the OAR and then how you did the REACH code this past go around in practice. And it just wasn't clear to me what, if anything, was different in developing that REACH code than if you were doing it the exact same way as under the base code.
You know what? I'm going to pull in a pinch hitter here.
I can take this one, Andy.
Thanks.
Sure. So thanks for the question. Right now, our rules just say on the REACH code that the reach code is whatever we post on our website with a new date. So there was no kind of clear process to follow in our rules on kind of how to do it. So we tried to kind of generally mirror the code adoption process. We accepted proposals, we held public hearings, and we took it to the board. There was no code committee. That's a difference. Usually the board would have the ability to, if they wanted to, appoint a code committee. And then ultimately we didn't adopt it by rule, which we do with all of our codes, our baseline code. So those were kind of two big differences. When we had the conversation with the residential board and the construction industry energy board a month or so ago on the residential reach code, they asked us basically to kind of come up with a process more like the code adoption process. And they asked us in the commercial process to follow that more formal code adoption process. So I think this conversation today is kind of asking what should our rules be around it so that there's predictability of what that process is. Should it have all of those same steps as code adoption, or should it be some of the same things but not all of the same things, that kind of thing.
And just to finish my thought, then I guess I would suggest it should just be the same, unless there's folks have good reasons why not. But why not be consistent and know that you're going through the same steps.
Thanks, Dave. Justin?
I guess I would say that I would want it to be as much the same as possible, so that we can have the public input and involvement in the due process that kind of goes through the whole thing. My answer is somewhat predicated on whether or not I know there was a bill this year to potentially give cities the ability to adopt the REACH code as their standard code. And I guess the REACH code, it's never, to me, since it's been an optional code, I think there's been a little bit more flexibility because people have had that choice as to whether or not they want to do it or not. But if you're going to start getting to situations where cities can adopt it and that's going to become their standard base code as a city, then I would hope that there would be as much public process as you can to identify that code, so that since it could potentially be a formal code for a city.
Any other thoughts that anyone else want to jump in and let their voice be heard? I got David Haslam and then Brian Krieg.
Thank you. I would suggest that it follow the same process because that's what folks are familiar with who are involved in the process. But I would actually additionally suggest that the discussion take place simultaneously, because I believe if you're simultaneously considering a measure that somebody might have proposed for the base code, essentially the code review committee says, doesn't seem like the market's quite ready for that yet, then they could say, but that might fit for the REACH code. And you would have the same code review committee that is being tasked with reviewing code elements to be able to handle both of those considerations rather than having to reestablish a second advisory committee at a later date. I think actually the overall burden to citizen participants and to the staff would be less if you actually were considering both of these at the same time and working to find out where things fit. Are they in the base code, or are they in what's currently an aspirational REACH code that's supposed to make people more familiar with them so it can later be considered for adoption as statewide base code. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Brian, and then I got Kristen next.
Yes, I think that utilizing the same process is going to be the best format. We've had, I think, fairly good success with that type of process with the boards over the years. I think it provides some consistency out there so that all the parties coming to the table on any of the issues will know what the process is, so that we don't have something that's just, completely different or even just partially different in the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Right, Kristen and Gary up next.
I'd like to echo some of what Brian said. And also, we find it really important that it goes through the board approval process. And so I would have concerns that deviating would take it away from that portion. Like Brian said, it's good to have that kind of known quantity and knowing that it's going through a specific process. So that would be our preference.
Gary?
Yeah, thanks. The process we went through on the residential reach code this last go around, frankly, I was fairly comfortable with. It did, I think, lead to a lot of discussion between different parties proposing what were very similar approaches, I guess I would say. And I would continue to be comfortable with that process as long as it continues to be a voluntary and aspirational code. But I would certainly support it if this reach code ever becomes a code that a jurisdiction can adopt as their base code, then it certainly needs to go through the same rigor. So I guess that's a way of saying if it stays voluntary and aspirational, I'm kind of comfortable with a little bit looser of a process, but not opposed to it going through the same process as the base code.
Thanks, Gary. Brian, did you have something else, or is that still just leftover?
Leftover, sorry about that.
No worries, thanks. Just want to make sure I'm not leaving anybody behind. One sort of follow-up question on this, and this goes a little bit off of what you were saying, David Hessel. I'm just going to use the whole name since there's more than one Dave. David Hessel, excuse me. With the timing for doing the code simultaneously versus sequentially, since the reach code is a little bit of a aspirational code based on the base code, it seems like there might be some challenge in terms of developing them simultaneously because the one could potentially change while you're still working on the other. Do you see that as a challenge, or do you see a way around that? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the chance to respond there. And frankly, I view it as more of an opportunity than a challenge, really, because again, you have a group of dedicated folks who are reviewing this, and they have an opportunity to weigh each individual proposal that's being made and see how they view that as, is it a market-ready change, for the industry to undertake? And what I've seen in the past is when they've said, "Nah, I don't think so," then there's been, no place for that to go. And then the folks who are considering the reach code aren't necessarily taking up the things that didn't make it through the base code discussion. You're restarting potentially. So by using that same amount of time, you are actually taking advantage of the people who at the moment are in that consideration mindset, right? So that's where I was saying, in my point of view, it's a time saving element, both from the individuals who are volunteering their time and from the overall span of time that developing a base code and a reach code requires.
Dave Vantoff and then Gary.
Yeah, Dave kind of hit what I was going to offer up at the very end there, which is that it would seem to be a more efficient practice to do it at the same time from all three stakeholder, board member, and staff perspective, rather than going through two separate processes, doing one process and considering, or at least covering it through one process.
Gary?
Maybe as a hybrid, like the idea of maybe having the same group of folks doing it, but maybe consider doing it in succession, although I realize that might extend the amount of time that the same group might review. I wonder if it might be better to establish the base code first. I think Andy has maybe you had hinted at, and then, but then continue right on after that with development of the REACH code. So again, I don't know, that might lengthen the time. Maybe that becomes more of an issue. But I would agree that maybe having the same group of people available to and willing to spend that amount of time makes a lot of sense.
Thanks, Gary. Dave?
Thanks, Gary, for making that comment. And I definitely see, that point of view, but I also just know the length of time period these things take. And if your concept is going to be that the base code has to be locked down first, and then you consider what might be in the REACH code, it just seems like that's going to reopen an entire proposal process after that fact. And then in order to have adequate time to put proposals together, you're talking about quite a long additional process, and the chance of keeping the same group together it gets lower because you have quite a bit of break in between the two. And my belief in this, and talking this through right here right now, is if you were to have it be simultaneous, you'd put a lot of the onus for the work on the proposer, because a proposer would have to put things into context, whether it was a base code proposal or a REACH code proposal. And then the main other thing I might say that this something like what I'm suggesting would require is the board, and especially their committee, would have to be given discretion to say, for instance, we think this base code proposal actually would be a better fit as a REACH code proposal. And if they had that discretion to do that within their discussions of a measure, then I think that's where the real efficiencies could take place.
Thanks, David. Any other thoughts on REACH code proposal process versus base code proposal process? All right, seeing none. Got issue 3, normalizing formatting metrics, inputs, and assumptions across residential energy proposals. Looking for feedback on ways to standardize formatting metrics, inputs, and assumptions in various residential energy code proposals from various stakeholders. The process of accepting and analyzing residential REACH code proposals during the code adoption process has been complicated by different proposals basing their analysis on different metrics, inputs, and assumptions, as well as the proposals formatting their analysis differently from one proposal to the next. If there are minimum requirements for formatting metrics, inputs, and assumptions, we could standardize the various residential energy code proposals, but then the proposals could more easily be compared to each other and allow for better analysis of the totality of proposals. The division uses a number of tools and methodologies to analyze energy use, energy costs, and construction costs. The division currently uses the federal energy cost methodology with some regional specific guidance to aid determining energy costs. The division has created a tool to assist with creation of energy code proposals to the REACH code. This tool includes a set of standardized assumptions as well as the option to change those assumptions. It includes fields to input performance metrics for each proposed component and to list the payback period for the proposal. That document can be found, and there is a link there in the issues document if you have that handy. It's on the BCD website. The division currently sets costs for units of energy for code compliance using a similar methodology for analysis of energy cost savings and proposals. The division developed a document for the REACH code to standardize construction cost comparison for proposals that impact on the cost of the structure. This document may be continuing to be developed going forward, and it also can be found on the BCD website, and there is a link in the issues document if you want to take a look at that. The intended goal is to create an energy code proposal process that results in proposals that the public and relevant boards can understand and can provide informed comment on. There was a number of options that we wanted to put forward for discussion on this one. Run through them really quick. Set the uniform standards for cost of energy for the duration of the residential energy code proposal period. Please provide any suggestions related to the uniform standard that should be used and whether specialized expertise would be required to apply these minimum standards. Setting minimum documentation requirements for residential energy code proposals for energy analysis to compare the code proposal to the current code. Please provide any suggestions. Can't read. Please provide any suggestions related to what those minimum requirements should be and whether specialized expertise would be required to apply these minimum standards. Set minimum requirements for comparing the construction cost, comparing the construction cost changes related to a residential energy code proposal. Please provide any suggestions about these minimum requirements and whether specialized expertise would be required to apply these minimum standards, or using some combination of the above options that I just mentioned. Okay. Do folks have thoughts on the formatting, metrics, inputs, and assumptions that can be normalized across energy code proposals? Justin Wood.
I'll start. I assume there's a fair amount of, we'll see if there's a lot of communication about this. I guess this has been a tough one for me because I tend to do smaller starter houses, and the code proposals, when I see the energy, specifically the energy codes, they never really seem to line up with what we see in the field. And so it seems like there is a good disconnect on that. And so it does seem like we need some work on how to get that more lined up. Some of the stuff, like I guess, and I don't have an easy solution for this, but I definitely would like to see us having some more uniform standards and also having some potential third-party peer review on these types of things. One particular issue that we see a lot of is particular manufacturers' items being called out as a specific, when you're talking about an energy code. And we find that those manufacturers, a lot of times that are called out, necessarily can't be sourced or sourced at the level that are actually needed to be able to build the levels of units we're seeing. And so it'd be nice as if instead of when you do a cost proposal, that you either average a few different sources, like for example, if you're looking at heat pumps or windows or various other things, that you have to look at 2 or 3 different options and then average out their cost increases. We had a recent situation in a different state where a particular brand of heat pump was used as a source for the cost increase. Yet the company that provided the estimate for that was a very small company that they couldn't meet the demand of what's being out there. So when you actually looked at a larger spectrum and tried to figure out where you can get more of those heat pumps, the rest of the heat pump cost was quite more expensive than what was readily available to the market. So I'm not sure if that all made sense, but I guess to summarize is having a third party look at it, but also to have more cost averaging on when you're potentially looking at that, so that it's not just one source, one supplier.
Thanks, Justin. Alana?
Thanks. Thanks, Justin. I just wanted to provide a little more context here since we've got lots of public processes going on at the same time, which is a good thing. The residential board asked us to put together a work group on home size and considering, in the next residential code adoption cycle, whether we should have different requirements for different thresholds of home size, which seems kind of related to what you were talking about around cost. And certainly I think we've found it challenging. We have to do a housing cost impact statement for every rule we adopt that impacts housing cost. And they set their house size at like a 3 and 2, 1,500 square foot kind of a thing. And I think that's insufficient for us to kind of have an idea of general impact, to your point. And so there may be an opportunity coming out of that other conversation, if we get some good thresholds on housing sizes for consideration, for to also kind of use those housing sizes for thresholds for cost in general, because that's been an ongoing challenge for us. I think we struggle with the cost because it always depends on what you're building exactly, right? And it depends on how big. And so I think some sort of averaging and coming up with some additional thresholds would be something that would really help us have that conversation, which has been just a struggle for us to kind of, what is it? We know it costs something, but it depends. It always depends, right? But coming up with some consistency, I think, would be really helpful for the decision makers.
Yeah, and I'll just add on. I know there's a lot of, even in the building community, there's people who like having the thresholds of square footages for some code bases, and some who don't. I am in the category of people who do, just because I think that it's harder to apply a one size fits all energy code, because or residential code even, because especially on the energy things, because it hits different size houses harder. And so when you're talking about affordability and how to make things work out, looking at things kind of across the spectrum of a few different sizes is great, especially if you want to look at averaging of costs across those sizes, as long as it's kind of factoring in the right sizes. Washington, for example, I think you touched on, I don't think they did a good enough spectrum. They went from 0 to 1,500, and then from 1,500 to, I think, 4,500, and then above. So there's that 1,500 to 4,500 square foot is such a huge delta of homes that, so if you're going to look at that, I think it's more like, figuring out what's entry level, what's mid level, what's high level, and kind of looking at it across those three levels.
David Essel?
Yeah, first I would just like to, give props to the the division for actually the work they've done so far in developing ways to analyze everything on more apples to apples basis, because, where we're at looking at the documents that they provided today, it's definitely a step in the right direction compared to there was a lot less there in the past in terms of how things were done consistently, and materials that were provided to people making proposals so that it can be done in a consistent fashion. So I think steps are going in the right direction. Just wanted to point that out first, and glad to hear Justin piping in about the size factor. Justin and I have talked about that in the past. Maybe it seems like the distant past now, but maybe it's not too distant, and especially even that relative part to Washington, because I believe that started at more like 3,000 or 3,500 feet. And then I kind of think it was the Washington home builders that moved it up to 4,500. So that could be productive discussion here to find ways to find those tiers. I think that would be fantastic conversation. I did have one question for clarity, Andy, where the bullet that was pointing out now that, the division currently sets costs for different items. I'm just wondering if the suggestion here within this discussion point is that the Bureau would continue, to provide costs, or maybe the Bureau or the division might start with an initial set of costs that is what they think measures cost, but they might not have all the measures that a proposer might be thinking about. So if that's the case, a proposer might have to bring their own costs, and again, to Justin's point, justify that with multiple sources instead of a single source for a cost analysis. But additionally, if there is a cost provided by the division for something, then I think that a proposer would still have the opportunity to provide what they believe is an alternative cost to that, as long as they provide a good basis for their assumption of cost, and setting ground rules, again, like, oh, maybe you need 3 different references or certain sources for that. But I think that level of flexibility should be available to proposers, because things around cost do tend to change over time.
Yeah, if I could just jump in and clarify, thanks for the comments. I think what we were hoping is that we could come up with some consistency for the proposers in terms of both the modeling that they do and the cost analysis they do on their own proposals. That they would do that kind of based on a consistent methodology that we come up with. And then the division will take a look and see, do we see it the same way? Do we see it a little differently? And kind of the board and the code committee can have both of those things and also weigh in and say, well, actually, in my experience, you didn't get this quite right. So we have as many opportunities as possible to talk about what the real world costs are. But also we're doing it in a consistent way where we're not just kind of apples and oranges all the time. That's the goal, I think.
Thank you. Brian, and then David has some back up again.
Yes, a little bit of a question, and it may not be an easy answer on this or a short one. In calculating the various costs and the increases that would occur with the different code changes, and this isn't just residential, this would actually affect all of the codes. Are we calculating in the extra costs of training to, say, the training centers for the trades, the contractors themselves for their knowledge needs on this, then of course our inspectors, plan examiners, building officials, et cetera, that are all part of the group? I mention this because as we've noted over the years, some of our apprenticeship programs have had to move from 4 years up to 5 years because we just have a lot more in the way of techniques, materials, et cetera, that are out there that we're having to cope with. And if those aren't really being calculated in, as we go through this, that there's going to be a cost. Those costs are going to get translated to the end customer in one shape, form, or another. But there's a lot of people who are impacted in the in between on that, and setup costs, et cetera, on that. It's a long time before we capture some of that. And just so as I say, that's kind of a big question and may not be an easy answer on that here.
Thanks, Brian. Sorry, I had a little message that I had to read. I'm actually going to defer to one of our technical humans. That either Mark or Kelly can jump in here and see if that goes into or Lana if she wants to jump on video.
Sure, thanks, Andy. And I hear what you're saying, Brian. I think those other costs, we try to capture them in our rulemaking document when we notice the rule adopting the code, in terms of training or just like buying code books, some of those kinds of costs. But the more that discussion comes for, earlier in the process from the folks who kind of understand what the impact will be on their industry or whatever in terms of that extra training, how big a code change, et cetera. I think that's all helpful information that helps folks think about the impact of the changes. So it doesn't usually it's not in the housing cost impact, some of that kind of stuff. We do try to capture it in the rulemaking, but I'm sure we can do a better job.
Thanks, Alana. David Heslin.
Yeah, just first a follow up to Brian and Alana there. The ICC processes and other model code processes tend to use the fully adopted incremental market cost for something like this. So rather than initial adoption cost, because once the new measure is adopted by the marketplace, the average cost per unit installed is really what the incremental cost is going to be borne by the market and by society at large when the market passes that price on to consumers. So, that's the pattern that's been used in these type of work for decades and decades. I would suggest that that's what we hang on to rather than introduce a new way of analyzing that. But I just wanted to go back to the point of establishing costs, and I think a best situation for the division might be that they make it very clear for how a proposer would establish what costs are and the considerations that need to be taken into establishing what those costs are, but that the division itself doesn't try to find itself into being the arbiter, the determiner exactly of what costs in the marketplace are. Because I think that would end up being a tough position necessarily for staff to find themselves within the discussion.
Thanks, David. I got Justin and then Gary on deck.
See, David and I can agree on stuff. See, I agree with David on, I think the most important thing to come out of this, hopefully, is to just establish an actual process and outline how the cost should be arrived by whoever's going to provide the cost with their proposals. Just because we see all the time. I mean, David and I have seen this on our own where we look at the same proposal and have different costs as to what we think that's going to be, but there's no real guidance as to how we come up with those numbers. And so it makes it hard for us to compare numbers on any of these things when we're just kind of going off of our own experience and not having any formal guidance as to what we need to do.
Thanks, Justin. Gary.
Yeah, hi, and I'll apologize if I had to jump off for a little bit and jumping back on. I think as long as a proposal comes in with a fairly complete and transparent calculation for how the costs were arrived at, or the data source, or the people they talk to, as long as that cost information is there and maybe complete enough for a review committee to at least it passes the laugh test. That's about as good as we can do, I think, sometimes. So just complete information on how the costs were arrived at, I think would be extremely helpful.
Thanks, Gary. Just about to call for one more. And Dave, what would you like to say?
I just want to agree with Gary. I mean, I think it's important that if whatever the system is that's used or methodology, that someone that's claiming it's going to cost X needs to show how they came up in pretty good specificity as to how they came up with those numbers, and not just say it's going to cost a lot or it's going to cost a little based on their experience. We need, you got to have something that you can evaluate and understand how they came up with those numbers.
Thanks, Dave. All right. Any additional thoughts on standardized metrics, assumptions, formats, inputs? All right. Seeing none, I'm going to keep scrolling.
Can I just do one bag here before we move on, Andy?
Yeah.
So this does have, inputs and assumptions as far as cost, but also in terms of modeling, right? I believe, and I don't think I heard a lot of comments on the modeling side. I think our next issue is also related to cost, I believe. But I'm just wondering if anyone has, while we have this group, any thoughts on the appropriate modeling inputs, assumptions, et cetera, for our code proposers to use.
David Haslam?
Yeah, thanks, Alana, for mentioning that. Because I forgot to comment on that bullet. But again, I got to say that it's been another step in the right direction of having the division provide a baseline set of assumptions that then can be modeled from that baseline. And I know the division's worked with NIA over the last few years on helping get that established, and I think I would encourage the division to continue to work with NIA, our Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, sort of our regional experts in that area, and or depending if Pacific Northwest National Lab was also a potential resource there, but basically as another tool to provide to proposers on residential energy proposals, a detailed model that can be assumed this is our baseline condition that we're modeling against. And I would say just an additional helpful thing within that would be if, targets that align with the executive orders that have laid out targets for energy code development could also be placed alongside the baseline inputs. So then folks would have an idea, is this measure or combination of measures aligning with the glide path that's been identified for the performance of our codes?
Thanks, David. Any other thoughts on modeling? Okay. Seeing none. I'm now moving on to issue 4, how to complete the cost benefit analysis of the energy savings created by the energy code proposals. Looking for feedback on the best method for weighing the cost benefit analysis of the energy savings created by submitted residential energy code proposals. Similar to issue, that's a misnumbered, similar to the previous issue, creating a standard way of analyzing the costs and benefits of the energy savings created by these code proposals will allow the division and the applicable code committees to more easily compare the impacts of one proposal with another. Some of the options for discussion, using federal rulemaking analysis methods, adding considerations for affordable housing, starter home builds, use regional construction weighting for final analysis, independent analysis of cost construction, or a combination of the above methods or additional methods. David.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. And this is one I've spent a lot of time talking to folks about over the last 5 or 6 years. And I mean, I would just guide us back to what is followed by ICC and ASHRAE within their code development processes, which is life cycle cost analysis that's in alignment with the FEMP standards. That's what happens at the national level. The key within that is establishing what a few key economic criteria are that get included in that consideration. But here in Oregon, as part of the work of the BWIG group from Executive Order 1720, Oregon Department of Energy, and with involvement from the Codes Division, did establish a life cycle cost analysis tool for use in analyzing energy savings in buildings over time, and that is available from Oregon Department of Energy at this point. So that's a tool that was developed basically to look at these issues, and has the approval of Oregon Department of Energy for that purpose. And so I would suggest that that's the tool that gets used to commonly analyze this. And I think the only additional work that might be needed, again, is to come to terms on what a few economic variables would be that would be plugged into the tool.
Thanks, David. Justin.
All right, I feel like I'm talking too much. So, no, I mean, one of the things it'd be really nice is if kind of like back to the last topic is if we had some standard around this, and if we can figure out personally, some type of a rate of payback would be really nice to see to weigh that into the value of, whether it's a 10-year rate of payback or some other period of time. I know that we've had that conversation at the national level with the Department of Energy and how they look at codes and the rate of payback. It'd be ideally if we can model that after how national codes are done, and look at that type of stuff. Also echoing back to figuring out not just one house, and I'm focusing on the residential stuff because that's where my focus is on, but not just one house but more of across the spectrum of 3 or 4 houses or sizes, and kind of average that out at how it affects everybody so that it can truly be weighed into. What's interesting is as we've looked at codes on the national level is it's been eye-opening somewhat to see how much more some of these code changes disproportionately impact smaller houses, but also lower income families. And I'm not talking the ultra low income, but kind of like your family wage job, and so while there is some argument to be made for their payback on things, the upfront costs that they're seeing is kind of detrimental for them to even be able to get into homes. And so factoring in that cost and not just the rate of return, but the true cost of what those upgrades or changes are over the course of that period of time, which is, the mortgage, the cost of the house, the cost of getting into the house, but factoring in all those costs as best we can. So, and I know that's not simple, but it's kind of what we've been trying to push for.
Thanks, Justin. Dave Vantoff, then Dave Haslam, then Gary.
I again am supporting Dave's proposal of looking to how they do it at the national level, but to the extent that payback is brought into consideration, to me that also can make sense. I don't know if that's how they in part establish those national cost assumptions, but to me, a home is not like a car or even a smaller widget appliance. It's a long-term investment. And payback in that context, in my view, ought to be looked at under a standard 30-year mortgage. How much, if that was the route that was taken around payback, how much more are you adding to a mortgage because of those costs versus how much are you saving on energy bills over the life of that 30-year mortgage?
Thanks, Dave. David Haslam, then Gary Heck.
Yeah, and I think when I mention something like life cycle cost analysis being the tool that does get used, within the model code development, it's also what gets used for proposals in Washington State and what gets used for proposals in California as well. That analysis produces as one of its results the payback period for what's being considered. Like it will tell you at what point does the savings overwhelm the upfront cost. And to David Vantoff's point, it also tells you on a monthly basis for a 30-year mortgage, what your payment is in this scenario versus the base case scenario. So conducting life cycle cost analysis produces a variety of outputs that does enable the people looking at that analysis to take all those things into consideration. Again, I'm very concerned about the equity side of these improvements, and I think it all depends what your assumptions are about largely whether or not this delivers an equitable outcome that's the lowest cost of home ownership for moderate income households. And I know within these discussions we had on this very topic, 2018, for instance, on a special committee assigned from the RMSB, people on that committee said, well, we should just consider this to be cash purchases because the people who I work with just pay cash. And therefore we shouldn't consider that a house gets financed. Well, that wasn't a very reasonable way to assess this from a moderate income family standpoint. Moderate income families aren't paying for a house upfront in cash very often. They're more likely to use a 3% down loan. So if you really want to look at it from what's more than likely to happen for a moderate income family, then your model would actually include that somebody's spending 3% down and financing the rest of it. And that would be the lens with which you look at it. If you want to look at more of a standard loan, then you'd look at 20% down. So those are some of the key economic factors that I was thinking about when I said those things would have to be determined. The tool is there. It's just waiting for a few of those inputs to be added. And if you wanted to take it to another level, you could look at it from a 3% down perspective and a 20% down perspective. And that would get you, a cross section of the population. I'm not sure if it's really worth looking at it from a straight cash perspective, given there's not a lot of folks paying cash. And those are probably not the folks we're most concerned about when we're looking at this. Just my opinion, but thank you.
Thanks, David. Gary.
Yeah, thanks. I think life cycle cost analysis makes a whole lot of sense as long as inputs and assumptions are reasonable. And I have not looked at the new tool that's been developed. So I can't make any judgments there, but maybe also a consideration as maybe as a backstop or a guardrail, so to speak, first cost considerations. So I think a life cycle cost analysis makes a lot of sense. Again, as long as the inputs and assumptions are reasonable.
Thanks, Gary. Justin.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Gary said on the life cycle cost versus taking it out over a longer period of time, because I've seen situations where we've taken a tankless water heater or gas furnace or heat pump or something and they put it onto a 30-year mortgage and figured out the cost, yet we have to, but then the equipment only has a 10 to 15-year lifespan, so you have to assume you're replacing it 2 to 3 times over the course of a 30-year life cycle. So factoring in that into a kind of what it's supposed to last and what your replacement cost is on it, at least would be, I mean, and I realize in 10 years it's going to be a different unit anyways, but just kind of factoring in that cost over the period of time, what it's supposed to last for the manufacturer would be a good assumption, I would think.
Thanks, Justin.
Yeah. And Justin, that is the standard practice when you're doing the life cycle cost analysis. The estimated useful life that's provided by somebody like out here, the Regional Technical Forum, you would put that within the analysis so that replacement cost was factored in.
Yeah, and I get that. I have seen certain situations where they take that cost maybe on something, let's just say that lasts 10 years and extract it, but put it in over the cost of the 30-year mortgage on the house. And my question on that has always been, it really should be just the first 10 years, because you're going to assume in 10 years you're going to replace it, and you got to figure out how to come up with that cost to replace it again. And so just making sure that it's kind of a 10-year rate of payback on that, not the 30-year rate of payback on what just that 10-year period. So I've seen different people do it different ways, and so I think just standardizing that's great.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting at with like having the rules, but general within the way that the model codes get developed, like the rules that are put out there by FEMP for their analysis methodology is you have to use a standard estimated useful life for a product if it's a product that does have less than a 30-year lifespan.
Thanks, guys. I don't see any other hands. Is there anyone else that would like to weigh in on cost-benefit analysis of energy savings? All right, seeing no one, scroll down to our 5th and final issue, specific for commercial energy code adoption. The Commercial Energy Code is adopted in Chapter 13 of the Oregon Structural Specialty Code. The commercial energy provisions are based on the most recent version of ASHRAE 90.1 with minimal amendments to align with state-specific and regional issues. The division and the Construction Industry Energy Board have used ASHRAE 90.1 because it is vetted by national stakeholders and has a robust review of the cost effectiveness of its provisions. The current process is to adopt the latest edition of ASHRAE 90.1 within 1 year of its publication. Early adoption with minimal amendments gives Oregon the benefit of the energy efficiency improvements in the code earlier and allows the use of the contract software. Once the division makes the established local amendments to the model code to conform to Oregon, the division holds a public meeting to update the public on the adoption process and to address minor revisions that were made to adapt ASHRAE 90.1 for use in Oregon. After the public meeting, the energy provisions are presented to the Construction Industry Energy Board for approval. If approved, provisions are adopted through formal rulemaking. The division seeks feedback on the process used to adopt the commercial energy provisions of the OSSC. The options that we have for discussion here are to continue to use the current process for adopting commercial energy provisions and adopt that process by rule, modify the current process for adopting commercial energy provisions, and if you have ideas for how to modify it, please suggest those modifications. I'm seeing no thoughts. Okay, I knew I could count on you, David.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Andy. I mean, I think everyone's trying to digest the paragraph if they haven't read the paragraph in advance of the meeting.
Fair point.
First, because point of clarification, like the way that the current process is described is sort of the new process that went into effect with the last go round, right? Because up until the switch happened to use ASHRAE 90.1 as the energy code, previously IECC was being used as the baseline, and the process looked pretty similar, if not identical, to the residential process, where the code was announced that this is your base code, now make proposals to that base code. So that changed with the adoption of ASHRAE 90.1. And so I think perhaps what other folks are looking at with this is there a where is the point in the process where if somebody wants to make a proposal to modify ASHRAE 90.1, that they make their proposal within an official proposal process? And maybe that's not part of it. And then Alana just came on, so maybe she wants to answer my question before I say anything else. So I'll put my hand down.
Sure, yeah, happy to weigh in. So basically, we switched over to this ASHRAE minimal amendment early adoption process a couple years ago. We did not end up with any administrative rules to support that shift. We had board direction to do it. We had the authority to do it, but now it's kind of like, is this how we want to do this for now on? Do we want to have no formal proposal period, earlier adoption, a commitment to earlier adoption like we just did in the spring? Or do we want it to go back to a code process that looks more like the residential energy code process? I think we laid out over the last couple of years why we felt that this shift made sense, availing ourselves of the national process and getting to it earlier. But that's kind of the question before us is, do we want to say the commercial energy code is different, we're doing ASHRAE early adoption, or do we want to say, actually, we want to go back to having a full code adoption process, including an open proposal period? I think without that open proposal period, certainly you can go to the board when they're considering ASHRAE adoption and then go to the public hearing. In the rulemaking, there's still those two opportunities, but we do not have a 45-day, how do you think we should amend ASHRAE 90.1 period? And so we want to either acknowledge this is a different process that doesn't have that code proposal period, doesn't have a code committee to review those code proposals, but is faster and doesn't have to go through publishing, or do we want to, go the other way? So that's kind of the question before us.
Gary.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I fully support utilizing ASHRAE 90.1 for our commercial code. It's a good code. It goes through a very rigorous process. It's under continuous maintenance, so they're always looking at it, improving it, tweaking it. And I think it's on a good trajectory to get us to our energy savings goals. So I just fully support utilizing with very few amendments or modifications 90.1 as our commercial code. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Any other thoughts on commercial energy code adoption? David.
Yeah, from what I know, I'm not a commercial code expert. I'm hoping there might be a few other folks online that are more of a commercial code expert than myself, but I know Gary is more so than I am. But one thing I would say, in parallel to the comment that I made around residential, if there was context provided on the energy modeling on the residential side to how are we doing at hitting our goals, just like on the commercial side, just like Gary said, well, he has confidence that adopting ASHRAE regularly will help us meet our goals. I think within, if this is going to be the process for early adoption, which is certainly streamlined, if there was, opinion provided by the staff at that time that said, and this is how this next version of ASHRAE is aligning with our goals, so that everyone involved in the process is being clearly informed as quickly as possible if that ASHRAE, if us being dependent on the ASHRAE process is actually enabling us to hit our goals or not. Because in getting that at the time that the adoption takes place would be really important, because if it doesn't take place for another year or more afterwards, then you're not getting the feedback in real time with the action. So that would be just a suggestion that would tag along with the streamlined adoption process, would be the provision of that kind of analysis of are we on target or not. Thank you.
Thanks, Sept. Anyone else have any thoughts on commercial code adoption? All right. Then I want to provide an opportunity really quick in case if there's anybody who, over the course of me scrolling through and going issue to issue, if you have either thought of something since we discussed an issue, or if you think of something now that you want to add onto the discussion about a past issue, I just want to give an opportunity for anybody to jump in now and not be able to say in the future that you had an issue that you wanted to discuss at the end, but could not address it. Anything that we didn't get a chance to touch on? All right, not seeing anybody.
Can I jump in just for a second? This is Daryl Fuller. I apologize.
Yeah, of course.
But as we've sort of gone through a lot of this stuff, I'm trying to figure out, and there may not be an easy way to do it, but we've gone sort of in my career from what we thought was a single code, and that was one of the hallmarks in Oregon, was we sort of had a single building code, and there seems to be a lot more irons in the fire. And I'm wondering if there isn't a better way to formalize a system where all of the appropriate codes, or excuse me, all of the appropriate boards that have fingers in this have to have this, even if they don't approve it. I would probably like to have all the boards approve it, but to make sure that all the appropriate boards at least have it as an agenda item so that everybody knows what everybody else is doing, because there has been at least a recent history where some boards weren't sure what other boards were doing. And if there isn't a way to somehow connect any of these changes to any existing, whether they're federal or state rebates, to know sort of how this could affect, whether you qualify for this program or that program. There just seems to be a lot of different fingers in the pots, and I'm just, I don't know what the sort of the best way to explain what I'm trying to get at, but it just seems like, especially with energy and building codes, that the left hand isn't always aware of what the right hand is doing. And even if the left hand doesn't have any authority over it, it certainly would be valuable for the right hand to get comments from the left hand before they move forward with something, because you're dealing with experts in different industries that might help provide valuable information prior to something being changed. Is that just too murky, or does that make any kind of sense at all?
I was going to try and answer you, Daryl, but Alana jumped on video, and my policy is to always defer to Alana. So
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Daryl, for the comment. And I agree with you. All of our codes relate to one another, and they've become complex. And in this area in particular, right? You know, where how does the electric vehicle stuff impact the electrical code versus the residential code versus the commercial code? Some of those things. Where do you print the right thing? And also on the process side, you know, before we kicked off this rack, we had a conversation kind of internally about how do our code adoption rules look generally, you know, as they apply to every code, not just energy provisions. And we found they generally work okay if we follow them and people know what they are. And we're committed to doing that, except for on the energy side. I think one of the benefits we have in this space for carrying this message to the other boards and other industries is our Construction Industry Energy Board, which has representatives from every board. We're certainly going to take these rules to the Residential Board and the Construction Industry Energy Board once we kind of take your feedback and get a draft together. But making sure that all the boards kind of hear back from those members, kind of a report out of what happened at that seed board, I think would be really valuable, because there are areas of overlap, certainly, and there are code provisions that's got to go through like 4 boards. And we don't want to lose sight of impacts we may not be aware of. So I think I take that feedback, and we'll make sure that as this process goes along, we get things to all the boards, kind of report outs from SEEB and what's going on with this rulemaking, because I agree with you. It's gotten pretty complex.
Well, and just sort of add on a little bit to that, in another part of my world where I represent the auto industry, there were some newly created incentive programs for people to buy electric vehicles or, you know, hybrid vehicles. And what we learned in that process in creating that new program is we sometimes hobbled ourselves and had to go back and fix some things because the language we used didn't quite meet this program's language or a different program's language. So where we might intend for something that we do to qualify somebody for a rebate, if we don't use the right language or if we don't talk to the right people, we end up codifying something that then prevents, you know, this particular system from qualifying for, you know, this particular federal or state rebate, when nobody would have thought that, you know, adding this particular standard was going to make things worse instead of better. And unless we go through all of the appropriate boards, and again, I understand, you know, while some of us might like more boards to have approval authority where they don't, if we can just at least make sure it's an action item on their agenda and they have an opportunity in when they're actually meeting to make comments, and those comments have to be considered by the other board prior to adoption, so that we know we've checked that box. Yes, this board heard it on this date. These were their comments. We considered their comments prior to going forward, right? That would make sure that all of the experts are having a chance for offering input.
Thanks, Daryl. Anybody else with any remarks or thoughts that have since occurred on either this issue or past issues? All right. Hearing none, I want to provide one more opportunity for anybody who maybe dialed in late, who was not on our initial call down list, somebody who did not end up on the RAC participation list, who has any thoughts at this point. Okay. Hearing none, that concludes our final issue. And I got to scroll to my closing script. Okay. This concludes the issues outlined for today's Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting. I want to thank you all for taking the time, for meeting with us, and for providing advice on these issues. If you have any additional advice, any thoughts that occur to you immediately after you hang up the phone, which is something that happens to me, you are welcome to send those in writing. Just go ahead and send them to that same rules coordinator email that you RSVP'd to. If you do have additional written feedback, try to get it to us by the end of this week so that we can actually have time to fully consider it and take it into account as we are beginning to write the proposed rules. And I'm going to stop right here because I see Dave Vantoff's hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't raise this. And I may have missed it in the materials, but what's the schedule for BCD to respond to this meeting and the five issues and any rulemaking that might occur?
We'll be bringing everything in. Like, this is all discussion is going to be brought into to be considered as a part of the rulemaking process. And then I believe, and either Julia or Alana could correct, probably Julia could correct me if I'm wrong here. I believe we're scheduled for a hearing on this in October. Or do we have a hearing scheduled?
We don't have a hearing scheduled.
I was thinking of something else. Sorry.
That's all right. We've got a lot of moving pieces right now, Andy. We do have lots of hearings scheduled, but not on this. So to answer your question, Dave, I think we wanted to see how many RAC meetings we needed, and it sounds like we got through our full agenda in one meeting. So that gives us the opportunity to, I think we're, based on the feedback, we should be able to have something drafted. We're subject to quarterly adoption. So my goal was April 1 for these rules. I think we could probably make January 1 pretty ambitiously and probably without as many of those board conversations Daryl was talking about. But I think April 1 realistically for kind of an adoption effective date is more achievable. So we're going to take the feedback we got here today, get a draft together, get that in front of the relevant boards, and then get that noticed. And so I'm hoping that around that same time in the spring, if we can have these rules in place, then we can kick off a residential code adoption process pretty soon after that, which I know feels crazy because October 1 is next week. And that's when our, anyway, it's coming up really fast. So that's the goal. Long answer to a short question is we're looking at April 1, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. As stated, we will begin drafting the rules. There will be plenty of opportunity for additional public comment during the rulemaking process. There'll be written testimony accepted as well as a rulemaking hearing held, not in October, but at some point before the rulemaking. If you have reached out to us to RSVP via email, we will make sure you are copied on any sort of announcements that come out regarding the rulemaking process. And if you would like to provide testimony on those rules, it will be welcomed and considered. Is there any final thoughts, Alana? Nope.
Really appreciate the conversation and everyone taking the time today.
Thank you, everyone. And we will keep you posted.